I found the telegram jammed behind a brittle field map in a box labeled Essen, April 45, which is the kind of filing that makes me feel responsible right up until I remember I am not. It was not meant for me at all. It was sent by a fire direction clerk named Harold Meeks to a tank platoon leader whose name was smudged by rain, and it gave a grid, a time, and one stray note that did not belong in a clean military message. Madonna plate. 2 digits of the coordinate were crossed out as if the pencil had slipped at the worst moment, and that tiny gap was enough to nag at me for weeks, because you cannot follow a story when the map has a hole in it. So I called an archivist in Essen and took the first appointment they would give me. On April 11th, 1945, in Essen, Germany, rain fell in a thin sheet that tasted of coal dust and burned oil, and it made the Krupp district look less like a city than like a forge that had been kicked over. Staff Sergeant Frank Cassidy stood beside a dead Sherman slumped in a gutter, its turret star charred to a bruise, and he scraped the last spoonful of spam onto his palm for a limping dog that had half an ear missing. The dog ate carefully, and the small mercy steadied Cassidy's hands, but it also cost him attention he could not afford in a place where corners killed. Up in the open hatch of Cassidy's own tank, the new loader watched him and let out a laugh that had no joy in it. Jimmy Walker was 19, fresh from a replacement depot, and his face still carried the soft lines of a boy forced to play an older part. "You feed that thing," Walker said, loud enough for the turret to hear, "and you'll start feeding every German who begs." The remark drew a dry sound from the gunner below, and Cassidy felt the crew's impatience closing around him like steel. Cassidy climbed onto the hull and looked back at the burned-out Sherman, because he had learned that wrecks were the only honest monuments left in Europe. "If you don't save something," he said, keeping his voice flat, "you turn into part of the steel." The sentence brought him no agreement, but it did mark the line he was trying to keep from crossing again. Inside the turret, the radio cracked with the clipped calm of a man reading from a board. "Red 2-1 fire net. Verify you are in grid. Prep begins at 21:45. Fire for effect at 2200. Timeline is locked." Cassidy stared at the map taped to the turret wall, where a boxed set of grid lines covered blocks of factory buildings and rail spurs, and he understood what locked meant. In the Ruhr pocket, April had become a factory in its own right, and the product was surrender, rubble, and bodies delivered on schedule. Cassidy keyed the microphone and gave the only answer the system rewarded. "FireNet, Red 2-1, we are in, we are moving." The response came back without warmth. "Resistance reported inside the plant blocks. Panzerfaust teams, clear the grid, do not stall." The words were meant to keep men alive, but they also turned everything inside the grid into a single category: targets. Ray Moran, the gunner, settled his eye to the site as if the site were a chapel and he were there to pray. "High explosive or armor-piercing?" he asked, and Cassidy heard the older man's hunger in the question. Moran had been in the war long enough to stop pretending he liked it, and long enough to hate the people who had made him stay in it. "High explosive ready," Cassidy said, "and you do not fire unless I say." The order tightened the turret air, and it cost Cassidy a piece of Moran's trust he would need later. Eddie Stone, the driver, eased the M4A3E8 forward, and the tracks bit into slurry made of rain, soot, and crushed brick. They rolled past broken forge halls and exposed steel ribs, past a toppled crane hook swinging slightly in the wind, and Cassidy kept his head out of the hatch because he had learned that you died when you stopped looking. He saw deliberate destruction as they advanced, cables ripped from conduits, machines smashed in their mounts, and he remembered the rumor that Hitler had ordered his own country burned rather than surrendered, the Nero order that had turned factories into funeral pyres. The thought did not change the street in front of him, but it made every wire and broken valve feel like a trap laid by a government against its own people. The maze tightened near a tram curve where walls pressed close, and the silence before the ambush made Cassidy's stomach clench. A cough of smoke erupted at the corner, and a Panzerfaust rocket slammed into the Sherman's side skirt with a sound that turned into a bruise in the bones. The tank lurched, loose casings jumped, and Walker grabbed the rack to keep from falling, but the hit did not punch through. The relief lasted a breath, and it cost them the next because Moran's hands were already swinging the gun. Cassidy shoved his face to the periscope and saw the shooter standing in the rain with an empty tube slipping from thin hands. The helmet on the boy's head was too big, and the strap bit into his chin, and the boy looked 12 at most. Moran's voice rose. "Target!" Cassidy clamped a hand on Moran's wrist, and the movement cost him the smallest thing that mattered most in a tank: time. "He just fired on us," Moran snapped, fighting the grip. Walker whispered an involuntary prayer, and Stone kept the engine idling like a heart that knew it might be asked to sprint. Cassidy looked again at the boy and saw eyes that were not brave and not even terrified in the normal way. They were emptied out, as if someone had already told him the ending. Cassidy could have let the gun speak and told himself it was clean, but the thought of a child's body disappearing under a 76mm shell landed in him like a weight. Cassidy popped the hatch and climbed out into the rain because he could not give the order he knew Moran wanted. He ran low along the hull, pistol in his hand, and the open street made him feel naked, which was the cost of choosing a human-sized solution in a war run by machines. The boy did not run. Cassidy grabbed his collar, slammed him against a wall, and shoved the pistol into his ribs to keep him still, even though every part of Cassidy hated using that kind of threat on a child. Behind the corner, half hidden in rubble, Cassidy saw a second Panzerfaust tube propped and ready, and the sight answered Moran's argument better than any speech. Someone had placed the boy as bait. Cassidy dragged the boy back to the tank, and Walker hauled him through the hatch, the child landing hard on steel and curling instinctively into a knot of limbs. Inside the turret, the smell of fear filled the space, old sweat, dust, and urine, and it made Walker's face go pale. Cassidy pulled the oversized helmet off the boy's head, revealing cropped hair and a scalp rubbed raw by metal. "Name," Cassidy said. The boy swallowed. "Hans," he whispered, and the name sounded wrong in the turret, too small for what it had already tried to do. Cassidy kept his voice low because loud voices turned the turret into a cage. "Who was behind you?" he asked. Hans's eyes flicked toward the corner as if the rubble itself could see him. "Black uniforms," Hans said, and his throat tightened on the words. "They said if I don't shoot, they shoot me." The sentence made the war uglier than a firefight, and it cost Cassidy the last easy story he could tell himself about who was fighting whom. "Where are the others?" Cassidy asked, already knowing the question was a trap he was setting for himself. Hans shook his head once, then pointed downward with a trembling hand. "Under," he said. "Shelter. Many kids. Wounded. They left us." He hesitated, then added what mattered most. "If we surrender, they shoot us first." The radio cracked again with procedural impatience. "Red 2-1, status. Prep in 20, push, do not stall." Cassidy keyed the mic and chose the only lie he could justify. "Fire net, we took a Panzerfaust hit, no penetration, maneuvering." The reply did not ask about casualties. "Maintain timeline," the voice said. "Clear the grid." The exchange bought Cassidy seconds and cost him the illusion that anyone above him would care what lay beneath the factory blocks. Stone inched the tank forward again, deeper into the plant maze, and Cassidy kept his head out of the hatch, watching windows that could hide another tube. He saw a ventilation pipe protruding from a mound of rubble, and he saw footprints around it, many small prints among the larger ones, and the pattern told him more than Hans's words. Cassidy dropped from the hatch, pressed his ear near the pipe and listened, and faint coughing drifted up through the metal like a confession. In that sound he heard the price of obedience, and he also heard the price of refusal. Cassidy climbed back into the turret and looked at his crew. Moran's jaw was set in anger. Stone's hands were tight on the levers. Walker stared at Hans as if the boy were a live grenade. Cassidy spoke anyway. "We're going in," he said. The decision gave them a direction, and it also turned the artillery schedule into a clock pointed at their own faces. Hands pointed toward a half-buried stairwell, and Cassidy led the way down, pistol raised, the concrete steps slick with algae and rain. At the bottom, a dented steel door held a faded stencil that said it was an air raid shelter, and Cassidy pushed it open. Candlelight and a battery lantern revealed a crush of bodies, children with hollow cheeks, old men in loose coats, wounded soldiers with dark bandages, and one soot-streaked woman holding a toddler too exhausted to cry. They stared at Cassidy as if he were either salvation or the last uniform they would ever see, and the weight of their eyes made his earlier order, clear the grid, feel like a sentence. Cassidy checked his watch, then glanced at the map in his head that was made of voices on the radio. Fire for effect at 2200 meant they had minutes, not options. He raised his hands, empty, and spoke slowly, using gestures more than language. "Artillery," he said, pointing upward, then tapping his watch. The limping German soldier nearest the front understood the grammar of bombs, and his face tightened as he turned and barked orders in German that rippled through the shelter like a shock. Panic surged anyway, because crowded people moved the way water moved when you kicked the bank. Children pushed forward, wounded men tried to stand, and the toddler began to wail as if the sound itself could keep the ceiling up. Cassidy grabbed the limping soldier's sleeve and forced eye contact. "Line," Cassidy said, dragging his hand through the air like a blade. "One." The German nodded, swallowed whatever pride he had left, and began organizing the strongest older boys into a cordon, which bought Cassidy a thin edge of order at the cost of relying on a man who might have shot him a week earlier. Hands tugged Cassidy toward the rear, away from the crush, and pointed at a narrow maintenance doorway half-blocked by fallen brick. Beyond it ran a low tunnel lined with pipes that smelled of oil and rust, the last breath of a factory that had once built weapons for a continent. "Out," Hans said. "Rail yard." The tunnel offered a way to move people without exposing them to streets full of nervous Americans, but it also offered the danger of collapse under a barrage, and Cassidy felt the cost of choosing it even as he accepted it. Near the doorway, half covered by a blanket, Hans pointed at a stack of Panzerfaust tubes. There were more than a handful, their green paint chipped, each one a short-range promise made to children. Walker, who had followed Cassidy down the stairs, stared at them as if they were snakes. Cassidy understood in one cold instant that if children emerged from a tunnel carrying those tubes, any American sentry would fire first and ask later, and the shelter would trade one kind of death for another. "Take them," Cassidy told Walker. "All of them." The order made Walker flinch, because carrying enemy weapons uphill in the open was suicidal, but he started anyway because he had no better plan. Cassidy returned to the crowd and made the next choice, the one that always hurt. He pointed to the tunnel and motioned the first group forward, then grabbed the shoulder of the woman with the toddler and guided her into the line ahead of stronger men because she would not survive a shove. That decision saved her seconds and cost Cassidy the silent anger of a wounded German who watched her pass. But Cassidy accepted the anger because the alternative was listening to a child drown under a stampede. The first bodies squeezed into the maintenance tunnel. The older boys moved them like freight, not gently but efficiently, hands on backs, voices harsh because harshness kept panic from blooming. Cassidy stayed at the doorway, counting with his eyes rather than numbers, and every few seconds he forced himself to look away from faces and toward the watch, because faces invited hesitation. Above them, the city groaned under distant detonations, and the sound reminded him that this shelter had been built for bombs from the sky, not for bombs called in by Americans who owned the timetable. Cassidy ran back up the stairs into the rain because he needed his tank in position before the first shell landed close. He climbed into the turret, and the crew looked at him as if he had brought the shelter's stench with him. "There are kids down there," Cassidy said, keeping his voice even. "There is a tunnel to the rail yard. Fire net will not delay. We cover the stairwell until the tunnel is clear." The sentence laid the plan on the steel floor, and it also laid the bill. Moran's face hardened. "You're putting us on the grid," he said. Stone's hands tightened on the levers. Walker, returning breathless with 2 Panzerfaust tubes slung like firewood, stared at Cassidy as if he wanted to ask permission to be afraid. Cassidy let the fear exist without feeding it. "Yes," he told Moran. "We are on the grid, and we are not moving." The declaration gave the crew clarity, and it cost Cassidy the last chance to pretend he was still obeying. He keyed the radio again, because he needed to be able to say later that he had tried. "FireNet, Red 2-1, confirm shelter with non-combatants inside grid. Request immediate delay." The reply came back fast and flat. "Negative Red 2-1, prep is locked. Clear and move." Cassidy released the transmit button and stared at it as if it had a pulse. Procedure did not hate him, but it would kill the people below him without noticing. "Stone," Cassidy said, "turn her crosswise." Stone backed and pivoted the Easy-8 with the slow, careful violence of a man moving furniture in a burning house. Tracks scraped a crumbled wall and shed bricks in a wet cascade. The hull settled broadside in front of the stairwell entrance, and the tank became a barricade that no pistol could push aside. The maneuver brought the shelter a shield, and it also made the tank a beacon for anyone in the ruins who still wanted to fight. Moran kept his eye to the site, tracking shattered windows and gaps between columns. Cassidy stayed half out of the hatch, rain in his face, because he needed the wider view. The factory blocks around them were a maze of broken steel and blackened brick, and Cassidy could not forget that the Ruhr had been Germany's last great industrial engine, the place where Krupp's furnaces had fed armies. Now those same blocks hid children with rocket tubes and men in dark uniforms who did not want witnesses. Movement flickered in a second-floor opening across the lane. Dark coats, disciplined posture. Cassidy did not see insignia, but he saw the way they moved, and it matched Hans's warning too closely to ignore. "Moran," Cassidy said, "coax only, short bursts." Moran's lips pressed into a thin line, but he obeyed, and the first burst stitched the window frame and forced the shapes to drop back. The action slowed their approach, and it cost them ammunition that could not be replaced. Down below, in the stairwell mouth that the tank now covered, Cassidy heard the muffled shuffle of feet as the evacuation line moved. Each sound was proof of life. Each sound also meant time was passing faster than steel could stop it. The radio voice continued its litany. "Prep in 5. The words were neutral, but the consequences were not. Cassidy glanced at his watch and felt his mouth go dry. A shell landed closer, the first of the preparatory fire, and the concussion shivered through the tank's suspension. Dust shook loose from ruined walls and drifted in the rain like ash. The black-coated men hesitated, then began moving again in short dashes, using the growing smoke and chaos as cover. They were not rushing Cassidy's tank. They were trying to reach the stairs and whatever still moved below. Cassidy leaned down the open hatch and shouted into the stairwell, "Move!" The word was English, but the tone was universal, and it cost him his voice, which came out raw. He heard a shout in German answer him from below, and the line kept moving. Moran fired another short burst. A dark figure flinched and dropped. Cassidy could not tell if the man was dead or only hiding, and the uncertainty was part of the cost of using machine gun fire to hold a moral line. "Prep in 3, the radio voice said. Hans appeared suddenly at the stairwell mouth, face streaked with dust, and he grabbed the edge of the tank's hull to pull himself up. "2 groups, he gasped in broken English. "Then done." Cassidy nodded and pointed him back down with a motion that was more command than kindness. Hans vanished again, and Cassidy felt the helplessness of sending a child back into darkness because the timetable demanded it. The first shell of the main barrage arrived like a door slamming. The ground jumped, the air seemed to compress, rain turned to steam in the blast haze. The Easy-8 rocked, and Stone grunted as he fought the instinct to run. The barrage was not personal. It was a machine doing what machines did, and it cost Cassidy the ability to hear anything below the stairs without leaning hard into the steel. Cassidy slammed the hatch shut to keep the dust out, and the turret became a vibrating drum of sound and pressure. "Keep them off the stairs," he told his crew through the intercom. "Nothing else matters." The order simplified the world, and it also narrowed it to a single failure point. The barrage thickened until the factory district seemed to breathe in dust and breathe out ruin. The tank rang with each near impact, and the vibration traveled through Cassidy's teeth as if the steel were trying to warn him. Moran kept the coaxial machine gun working in disciplined bursts, while Walker fed belts with hands that shook but did not stop, and the effort held the black coats at distance at the cost of burning through their last easy advantage. Through the periscope, Cassidy caught one of the dark figures sprinting low toward the stairwell, pistol raised, using blast smoke as cover. Moran swung the coax down and fired, and the runner collapsed into the mud before he could reach the opening. The kill bought them seconds, but it also confirmed what Hans had said. Because the next man did not aim at the tank, he aimed into the stairwell mouth as if the people below were the real target. Cassidy looked at his ammunition and saw the edge of the cliff. The coax belt was nearly done, and the main gun had one high-explosive round left, which in this tight lane could collapse the stairs they were trying to protect. He chose to put the risk on brick instead of on bodies. "Load HE," he ordered. Walker slid the heavy shell into the breach. Cassidy swung the 76mm to the corner where the shooter had appeared, aimed for the masonry, and fired. The blast turned the corner into dust and broken timber. Cassidy threw open the hatch and checked the stairwell immediately, because winning the lane would mean nothing if he buried the shelter. The opening was narrowed by falling debris, but it remained open, and the relief came with a fresh cost. They had spent their last main round. The coke sputtered once more and went silent as the belt ran out. For a brief moment the turret held only artillery and the engine's vibration, and Cassidy understood they had reached the part of the plan that used weight instead of bullets. He leaned towards Stone. "Forward 1 yard," he said. Stone pushed the levers. The tank lurched, and the hull shifted directly over the stairwell mouth until the opening vanished beneath steel. The move cut off any pistol shot into the stairs, but it also cut off Cassidy's access to anyone still below, and he felt the moral weight of sealing a door he had just opened. Cassidy needed proof the tunnel was still moving. Walker climbed out, dropped to the ground, and descended 2 steps into the stairwell to listen, then sprang back up with rain and dust on his face. "They're still moving in the tunnel," Walker gasped. "I can hear them." A faint series of knocks echoed up through pipes beneath the street. 3 taps, then 2. An old maintenance signal Hans had mentioned, and Cassidy took it as the only confirmation he trusted. The last group had cleared the exit point. Stone looked back, eyes wide. "We can back out," he said, and the plea carried the crew's survival in it. Cassidy chose the least dishonest compromise he could. "Back out slow," he told Stone, "and stay between the tunnel exit and anything that runs at it." It was not a guarantee, but it kept the tank's mass in the only place where mass could still matter. They reversed in a grinding crawl toward the rail yard as the barrage drifted away to the next square on the timetable. Behind a collapsed wall, a maintenance hatch burst open and evacuees spilled into the rain, children blinking, an old man dropping to his knees in mud, the soot-streaked woman lifting her toddler as if proving the child was still real. Hans emerged last, coughing, alive, and he raised a hand toward the tank in a gesture that was neither gratitude nor surrender, only confirmation. Cassidy watched the yard for dark coats and saw none. Either the barrage had buried them, or they had slipped away when their purpose failed, and Cassidy knew men vanished in a collapsing pocket as easily as smoke. He keyed the radio because he needed the war to record something, even if it recorded the wrong thing. "FireNet, Red 2-1, sector clear, moving out." The reply was flat. "Roger, continue mission." There was no question about the shelter because the schedule had no place for it. By morning, the rain weakened and a washed-out sun lit the Krupp ruins with a pale, almost shameful light. Cassidy's tank sat still in a courtyard, crews slumped in exhausted silence, and Cassidy stayed awake because sleep felt like a betrayal of the minutes he had stolen. A soft step crossed the yard, and Hans appeared alone, carrying a rusted machine plate heavy in his small hands. In its corroded oval, a woman's face was faintly stamped, the kind of workshop Madonna men once nailed above a lathe. Hans set the plate against the tank's hull with deliberate care, as if placing a witness where it could not be ignored. "Madonna," he said in careful English. Cassidy nodded, because the single word held the shelter, the tunnel, the locked timetable, and the 15 minutes that had separated children from dust. Hans walked back into the ruins and disappeared, and Cassidy returned to the turret with the plate resting against his steel, aware that in Essen on April 11th, 1945, the only thing he could measure cleanly was that people had walked out of the tunnel alive.